Imagine a continent choking on its own ash and pulverized stone. It is the middle of the 20th century, and the greatest, most mechanized geopolitical bloodbath in human history has just ground to a sickening halt. Cities that once stood as monuments to Western civilization are now nothing more than jagged concrete teeth jutting into a gray sky. Millions lie dead beneath the rubble. The air still smells acutely of cordite, burning timber, and mass starvation. Sworn enemies stare at each other across newly drawn, heavily militarized borders, gripping their rifles, waiting for the inevitable spark that will ignite a third global inferno. The infrastructure is gutted, the treasuries are entirely drained, and the population is deeply traumatized. It was in this suffocating atmosphere of intense paranoia and total ruin that a handful of desperate diplomats proposed an idea so radically absurd it bordered on pure institutional madness. They did not suggest signing a peace treaty. Treaties had failed spectacularly for centuries, repeatedly torn up the moment a new dictator grew hungry for land. Instead, they suggested a mechanism. A silent, invisible cage forged from the very raw materials used to build weapons of mass destruction. They decided they would bind the industrial war machines of fiercely proud rival nations together so tightly, so inextricably, that starting another war would become physically, economically, and mathematically impossible. This was the dark, desperate genesis of the grandest, most complicated, and arguably most fragile political experiment of the modern era, the European Union. Let us step back into the long shadows of a devastated continent just attempting to find its footing in the late 1940s. The traditional centuries-old method of dealing with a defeated enemy was absolute punishment. You strip them of their wealth, dismantle their factories piece by piece, steal their patents, and publicly humiliate their political leaders. But a pragmatic economic planner and a visionary foreign minister, a mild-mannered man born right on the violently contested borderland between two dominant rival powers, saw the fatal cyclical flaw in this ancient logic. Humiliation only breeds deep, festering resentment, and resentment eventually builds highly motivated armies. If you want to permanently stop two massive continental powers from slaughtering each other every 20 years, you have to surgically remove their ability to unilaterally forge steel and mine coal. Coal is the combustible lifeblood. Steel is the hardened skeleton of the military-industrial complex. Without unfettered access to both, you cannot cast the chassis of a tank, you cannot bore the barrel of a rifle, and you cannot manufacture high-explosive artillery shells. So, operating in absolute secrecy to avoid immediate nationalist backlash, they drafted a revolutionary blueprint. They proposed a centralized, supranational authority that would indefinitely manage all the coal and steel production of these historic, blood-soaked rivals. It was a staggering, almost unthinkable surrender of national sovereignty. Imagine the audacity of telling a proud, ancient nation, fresh out of a brutal war for its very survival, that it no longer possessed the legal right to control the output of its own sovereign blast furnaces. Yet the sheer, crushing exhaustion of endless generational bloodshed forced their reluctant hands. 6 neighboring nations eventually signed the initial, highly controversial pact. The signing ceremony was entirely unglamorous. There were no grand military parades, no triumphant fireworks illuminating the night sky, just exhausted men in heavy gray suits sitting in smoke-filled rooms, signing stacks of dense, impossibly dry bureaucratic paper. But within that boring paper lay an invisible, earth-shattering architectural marvel. They systematically abolished all customs duties on these critical raw materials. They created a joint high authority to oversee distribution. They built a common assembly to resolve disputes without resorting to gunfire. The immediate physical result was an unprecedented economic explosion. Heavy industrial factories that were nothing but bombed-out skeletal husks a decade prior were suddenly churning out massive steel girders, thousands of miles of rail lines, and civilian infrastructure at a blistering pace that absolutely baffled global economic observers. The success was so undeniable, so wildly profitable, that the architects quietly set their ambitious sights on something much larger. If you can successfully pool the volatile industries of coal and steel, why not agriculture? Why not automotive manufacturing? Why not the labor force itself? Why not consolidate the entire economic output of half a globe? They drafted sprawling new treaties, quietly and methodically expanding the legal parameters of this strange new bureaucratic machine. They created an economic community, a vast, borderless common market where heavy goods, specialized services, and eventually human beings could flow across international borders, as if those borders were merely imaginary lines drawn on a map by dead ghosts. Let us tear down the blueprint of this rapidly expanding political monolith to see how it fundamentally rewired the geopolitical world. By the time the final decade of the 20th century rapidly approached, the continent was financially and psychologically ready to cross the absolute Rubicon. The economic community was aggressively mutating into a true, recognizable union, a sprawling quasi-imperial superstate with its own powerful parliament, its own supreme courts capable of overriding national laws, and a labyrinthine administrative capital that began to rigidly dictate the shape, size, and safety standards of absolutely everything from heavy industrial machinery to the exact permissible curvature of agricultural produce. But to truly permanently bind these culturally distinct, fiercely proud nations together, they needed the ultimate economic adhesive, a singular, unified fiat currency. They needed to systematically strip away the centuries-old national currencies, the beloved coins and colorful notes that bore the faces of their historic kings, legendary queens, and revolutionary heroes, and brutally replace them with mathematically standardized money entirely controlled by a newly minted central bank located in the continent's financial heartland. This was not merely an economic policy adjustment. It was a deeply invasive psychological rewiring of hundreds of millions of ordinary citizens. To mathematically achieve this, sovereign nations had to drastically alter their domestic spending, artificially align their inflation rates, and legally hand over the keys to their monetary policy to a panel of unelected, highly insulated economists sitting in a sterile glass tower. If you are obsessed with decoding the hidden mechanics of geopolitical power and the invisible economic systems shaping our future, hit that subscribe button. We unearth the complex architecture of global history like this every single week. Returning to the sprawling, frictionless machinery of this continental union, the actual physical introduction of the single currency was a logistical titan that rivaled the complexity of a major military invasion. Armored trucks secretly crisscrossed the continent under the cover of total darkness for months, delivering billions of newly minted, highly secure notes to underground vaults in thousands of different cities. To avoid showing favoritism, the new banknotes were brilliantly designed to feature fictional, non-existent bridges and abstract archways, ensuring no single nation could claim cultural dominance over the money. On launch day, cash machines from the frozen northern tundras to the sun-baked southern islands dispensed a strange, foreign-looking paper that suddenly held the entire crushing weight of the continent's combined economic output. The immediate resulting frictionless trade was incredibly intoxicating. A heavy machinery merchant in a southern coastal nation could instantly buy highly specialized industrial equipment from a northern manufacturing powerhouse without losing a single fraction of a percent to predatory exchange rates. Wealth flowed like a massive, unleashed river. The Union expanded rapidly, eagerly absorbing nations that had only recently broken free from the catastrophic collapse of a rival Eastern communist empire. The map of the Union swelled outward, aggressively gobbling up territory, aggressively standardizing human rights laws, and pouring massive, unprecedented funding into infrastructure in its poorer, historically neglected regions. From the outside looking in, it looked like an entirely unstoppable utopian juggernaut. A seamless, incredibly wealthy bloc of over 500 million unified consumers, wielding a collective bargaining power so immense that it forced even the most aggressive, technologically advanced foreign superpowers to immediately comply with its massive regulatory gravity. But beneath the polished marble floorboards of this bureaucratic utopia, immense, terrifying tectonic pressure was building silently. The hidden reality of the Union was that its brilliant architects had accidentally created a monstrous, unstable structural paradox. They had perfectly unified their money, but they had absolutely refused to unify their treasuries. You essentially had massively diverse, highly incompatible economies, some built on rigorous, hyper-efficient, highly taxed export manufacturing, and others heavily reliant on relaxed seasonal tourism, massive unchecked public spending, and incredibly generous early pensions, all violently shackled to the exact same rigid currency. When the global financial system violently fractured and collapsed in the late 2000s, this hidden paradox finally detonated with apocalyptic force. The southern, heavily indebted nations could no longer simply print their own national money to rapidly devalue their way out of the crisis, which was the traditional historical escape hatch for suddenly struggling economies. They were legally and permanently trapped inside the iron cage of the central bank's rigid, unyielding monetary policy. The resulting financial shockwave threatened to violently tear the entire continental union apart at its seams. The wealthy northern nations, utterly terrified that their own hard-earned savings would be completely wiped out by the cascading defaults of their southern neighbors, demanded brutal, agonizing economic austerity. They leveraged their massive financial power to force the struggling nations to ruthlessly slash public pensions, fire tens of thousands of essential public workers, and entirely gut their social safety nets in exchange for massive, high-interest bailout loans. Suddenly, the glorious union did not look like a peaceful brotherhood of equals. It looked entirely like a vast, cold, predatory debt collection agency run by incredibly powerful creditor nations, dictating the miserable daily lives of millions of furious, deeply impoverished citizens in the South. Violent riots erupted instantly. Choking clouds of tear gas filled the historic plazas of ancient capitals. The unelected bureaucrats sitting safely in the Union's headquarters were universally vilified, widely seen as out-of-touch, aristocratic elites sipping expensive espresso in climate-controlled glass chambers while ordinary hard-working people literally starved in the streets below. This deep, systemic, terrifying friction revealed the darkest, most fatal flaw in the entire grand design. The Union had successfully, brilliantly integrated capital, corporate regulations, and consumer markets, but it had entirely failed to integrate the deeply tribal human soul. There was no single, unifying continental identity when the pressure was applied. When pushed to the absolute brink of financial ruin, ordinary citizens did not see themselves as loyal brothers and sisters under a unified blue flag. They retreated instantly and aggressively to their ancient, familiar tribal borders. They blamed the foreigners. They blamed the shadowy central planners. This rapidly rising tide of bitter resentment fueled a fierce, unstoppable resurgence of aggressive nationalistic pride, eagerly weaponized by opportunistic populist leaders who brilliantly painted the Union as a tyrannical, faceless empire that had systematically stolen their sovereign democracy. This simmering, continent-wide rage finally reached a spectacular boiling point when a major, fiercely independent island nation, a massive, globally connected economic pillar of the Union itself, held a shockingly contentious public referendum and deliberately chose to amputate itself entirely from the bloc. The unprecedented departure was a chaotic, humiliating, multi-year political bloodletting that permanently shattered the long-held myth of the Union's inevitable, unstoppable expansion. It definitively proved to the entire watching world that the invisible iron cage could indeed be broken, albeit at immense, deeply painful economic and social cost. Yet despite these staggering internal fractures, endless bureaucratic nightmares, and constant political infighting, the Union has stubbornly refused to collapse. It remains, against all odds, the most formidable regulatory superpower on the face of the planet. Its unbelievably dense rules dictate the strict privacy standards of the entire global internet. Its uncompromising environmental mandates force the most arrogant multinational tech monoliths to physically redesign their proprietary hardware just to access its incredibly lucrative consumer market. It commands a combined economic output that comfortably rivals the absolute greatest, most heavily armed superpowers on Earth. The complex legacy of the Union is a fascinating paradox of staggering historical proportions. It is an incredibly slow, deeply flawed, infinitely frustrating bureaucratic machine that generates endless red tape and political anger, yet it has simultaneously achieved precisely what those desperate, terrified diplomats set out to do in the smoldering, radioactive ashes of the 20th century. It has successfully engineered the absolute longest period of uninterrupted, total peace among its core member states in all of recorded human history. The massive industrial blast furnaces no longer produce high-explosive artillery shells to fire blindly across the heavily militarized border. They now produce the high-grade steel that seamlessly builds the magnetic high-speed trains physically connecting their ancient capitals. The grand, unprecedented experiment is neither a flawless utopia nor a tyrannical dystopia. It is a breathtakingly complex, infinitely fragile, incredibly stubborn mechanism of endless political compromises, inextricably bound together by the terrifying, unspoken knowledge of what exactly happens when the continent is left entirely to its own dark, destructive devices. It constantly forces us to ask the uncomfortable question of whether the steep price of absolute, unbreakable peace is the quiet surrender of absolute, unchecked freedom, and whether a purely rational, mathematically driven machine can ever truly, successfully govern the highly irrational, historically violent passions of the human heart. If you passionately want to keep peeling back the complex layers of the invisible political systems, hidden architectures, and forgotten histories that quietly dictate the very reality we live in today, make sure to hit subscribe and join our growing community of fiercely curious minds.